In this episode of the Omega Podcast, we have Alfredo Rodriguez, a government official and cybersecurity administrator. This episode will focus on the risks associated with deepfakes and discuss best practices for creating a robust cybersecurity strategy, including multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication, and biometric security measures.
Welcome to the Omega Podcast with Alfredo Rodriguez, the Cybersecurity Administrator for the town of Wellesley. It is such a pleasure to have you on the podcast, Alfredo.
Thank you, Keenan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really happy to have the time to talk on this podcast.
Absolutely. I'm super excited for our conversation today as we take a deep dive into cybersecurity, deepfakes, and providing resources to business owners as to how they can protect their business from international or domestic harm when it comes to the web. But before we can get into all of those critical details, Alfredo, can you share with our listeners a little bit more about yourself and your role as the cybersecurity administrator?
Sure, a little bit about myself. Got my education from UMass Lowell, got a master's degree in cybersecurity, where I learned a lot of technical background on networking, understanding security features in computers and networking and how computers work and how they communicate with each other. And as a town administrator, I'm there to help bring the right security tools to keep the town safe from any threats in the digital landscape. So whether that be a hacker or whether that be misconfigurations in certain tools, because that also can be a threat to certain organizations or towns that, hey, if something's not configured right and not working properly, that might disrupt workflow. So that's kind of what I'm in charge of. And in this podcast, I can help clear up any questions you may have, Keenan. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Fantastic. I know for our listeners, they are extremely concerned is the best word to use in this instance when it comes to cybersecurity, especially when you hear about deepfakes, when you hear of organizations being hacked internally where they have their personal data from their customers being utilized for malicious use. In your particular domain as a cybersecurity specialist, there's so much going on, especially when it comes to how businesses and leaders can be able to have the best resources to combat these types of threats. As my first question, how do deepfakes pose a threat to cybersecurity, and what measures can organizations take to mitigate these risks?
Yeah, great question, Keenan. For listeners who may not know what deepfakes are just animated videos created by AI. So if you think about it in like simplistic terms, it's just a video generated by a computer. So how can this be pose a threat? It could basically just be emulating any scenario you want in a realistic format. So examples that can be a threat in this country would be, think of when the president gives the State of the Union, and usually it's seen on TV and it's a recording and he's presenting a speech. Well, deepfakes pose a huge threat because they can impersonate the president himself and pose as a State of the Union when really it was just a computer making up the script and opposing the visuals. So deepfakes basically can be used for social engineering. This is a key word in cybersecurity. Social engineering explains how people manipulate and try to control other people's feelings to get them to do what they want. So with deepfakes, it can be used to pose false information. It can impersonate real important people in this world. So it can be whether from a company, it can impersonate executives to impersonating important officials, and it can damage reputations, right? Because with deepfakes, you can control what the message says as well, not only the visual to make it realistic, but also what the person is saying. So with that comes a lot of power of damaging reputations. And, organizations should educate employees on what deepfakes look like. Luckily, we're still at a time period where deepfakes are easy to detect. Sometimes the video comes buffering, or it can show some misconfigurations, like the hand doesn't look quite right or their smile doesn't look quite human. So we're luckily in a state where that's still the case, but education is really the first and most important thing to have when it comes to deepfakes, so that you can understand what is real, what is not, and establishing AI-driven detection tools as well, using software in computer to detect if the video is a deep fake. So, there's a lot of things you can do to help prevent this, but it's important to know what it is at first to understand what kind of threat you're dealing with.
Yes, for sure. And I really appreciate you mentioning that there's easy ways to detect these types of deepfakes, especially when it comes to the misconfigurations or the distortions of the person's face, their human attributes. Because for many people, they can look at an image and think it's the person themselves. But if they can be able to look deeper into the image to identify exactly that this is not real, it's going to help them without clicking on a particular link, investing, or whatever the action would be from their end. But as we talk about these types of tools being utilized, I mean, in the foreseeable future, as these deepfakes get more and more realistic, I mean, what would be your caution to business leaders, to individuals that are on the internet, social media, that are going to be seeing more of these deep fakes in their feed? I mean, how do you think they can be able to be more informed, or what resources do you think they should be looking into to stay informed or abreast of when it comes to this type of tool?
Yeah, good point. In the future, it is going to evolve, and to stay informed is just basic cybersecurity awareness to get you started, understanding that social engineering is a tactic, right? And there's different tools used in that tactic, and understanding to verify your sources and verify that that video is coming from a legitimate source, trusting who sent it, who made it, verifying that, making sure that you can verify with another person that, hey, this is legitimate, this is a real video, this is coming from the real person, this message is coming from a real executive. So for future proof, understanding social engineering is probably the best first step to take to prevent these kinds of attacks, and just making sure you verify who the person is speaking and make sure it's a legitimate source.
Yes, legitimacy. I love the phrase trust, but also verify, making sure that you trust the source, but you also do your digging and researching to make sure that it's valid, that it's truly coming from the direct source. Thank you for sharing that. In what ways can understanding 503 and 504 errors help IT professionals improve their cybersecurity strategies? I think I had shared with you a very recent incident that I experienced, where there was an incident where we had an IP address in a foreign land hack our existing website and took it down for a period of time. We were able to reboot it via a backup. But for a lot of business owners, they're not really comfortable with those particular terms. Can you sort of break that down and how more business leaders can be more literate to those particular areas?
Absolutely. So when it comes with 503 and 504 errors, that relates to networking, and understanding how your network works is important on how your business can continue running. And 503 typically means the service is unavailable, and 504 usually means there's a gateway timeout in your network. So these errors usually hint that something's happening, right? So like maybe a DDoS attack. And when I say DDoS, that's a denial of service. And to break that down a little bit more, that means an attack where they specifically target hardware to overload it with a lot of requests so that it can just break down. And that specific hardware being a router, a firewall, it could be any of those important components when it comes to networking. So the fact that I had to, just mention what each of those were, and it all relates to networking, is kind of a clue that you need to understand how your network operates and works in a technical way, so you can better improve your cybersecurity strategies. Because monitoring these errors can help identify abnormal spikes, and you can then prioritize network hardening and redundancy strategies. So luckily for you, Keenan, having a backup is the right move, and having a backup to restore from can save you millions when you talk about businesses, right? So having those strategies is important, but it all comes down to understanding how the network works, to understand that, hey, this is a vulnerability, let's patch it up and let's fix it so we're not vulnerable to an attack.
For sure. And I really understand that having a backup was sort of our go-to, because when the website went down, everyone panicked. We're like, what's going to happen? Clients are reaching out, employees are concerned, and we were able to reboot it literally within the hour, which helped us astronomically. But for a lot of business leaders, they don't have those resources. resources. They don't have that knowledge to have that consistent backup, because we don't expect that an international threat is going to be poised within our existing organizations here in the United States. But when it comes to international threats in cybersecurity, how does that differ from domestic threats? And what strategies can businesses implement to address them?
Yeah, that's a great segue into understanding why these attacks are happening, right? Because sometimes it's financially related, which is most common with domestic threats, where someone's just trying to get a paycheck with ransomware. So with ransomware, that's a malware that infects your computer, locks you out, and demands a ransom out of it. So a paycheck, if you think of it in that way. And let's dig a little deeper into that, because when it locks you out of your system and requiring payment, you're kind of stuck in a hard situation where most of the time people do pay. And most of the time people do pay a pretty penny for their service to be restored. So that's usually what domestic threats involve. Not saying that that's the all be all, but most common attacks that are domestic are financially related. But when it comes to international threats, that's when things get a little bit scarier, and it can impact the way of life on certain countries. So to give you a specific example, international threats often involve state-sponsored actors, and state-sponsored actors are attackers who are being sponsored by their government to launch that cyber attack. So imagine all their resources to go ahead and launch the cyber attack is tremendous. So like with a lot of backing, a lot of support, a lot of money, a lot of resources, you can carefully and expertly deliver a cyber attack that can impact infrastructure. It can impact SCADA networks. And what are SCADA networks? That's things that control the water system, the light system. So think of your utilities that every citizen uses in this country can be attacked by the international threat. So when you think about it, international threats often involve changing the way the quality life of the country is. So if that's impacting critical infrastructure, that can change the whole way society works and really put a big danger into how we live our everyday lives.
Very well said. It's impacting our everyday life, and it's so important that we understand these critical areas because they're vulnerabilities. They're things that we should be aware about, that they're happening around us. Even though it might not be impacting us on a day-to-day basis, they're there. And within a blink of an eye, it can change your entire life. And one thing that I oftentimes do on my own is that I do my own personal research. I talk to other business leaders about what they're doing. But what best practices should organizations follow to strengthen their cybersecurity posture and protect sensitive information? I mean, it's very different for different organizations. I mean, if you're thinking about a hospital, they have patient information, they have social security numbers, they have records from their individuals. Or if you think about the government, they have records from people from when they were born, if they had committed a felony, all of this data about different personnel, there's different levels to this protection that needs to go into play in order to ensure that people aren't getting access to it, one, but also international or maybe even domestic threats don't have access to it. Do you have any practices or best strategies that can be utilized there to help?
Absolutely. I would say the first step into understanding what to protect is to identify. So understanding your data, understanding what's sensitive, understanding what needs to be protected is definitely a first step for every organization to do it formally, not informally, because sometimes there's turnover, right? What if an employee who knew everything about the organization and what data to protect leaves? If there's no formal procedure, then how is that company going to survive after that person leaves? So identifying it in a formal way is definitely a best first step for organizations to take. But to take that one step even further, I think implementing zero trust architecture is important as well. So when I say zero trust architecture, I mean making sure every employee is given access to the resources they need to do their job and no more. So making sure there's no overflow of permissions to make sure that they're not doing anything nefarious as well. Sometimes it's by accident. If you give an employee who has access to sensitive data when they don't need to and they accidentally delete it, well, that's not something a tool can stop when it's really human error, right? And preventing human error is kind of the most important thing, because that's our biggest weakness as humans, is that we still make mistakes. Whether we have a tool that automates everything or not, we're still making the mistakes, and it's important to prepare for that. So implementing zero trust in an organization is important, and I think enforcing strong access controls is another step organizations can take. Again, that's just going even deeper into zero trust and making sure every employee has the controls they need, and if they overstep their boundary, that they're denied and they can't access it, right? So that helps prevent hackers when they take over account, for example, and they have access to your account and they're trying to do nefarious things, that they're limited by what access you have for that employee. So, implementing those strategies are good. Encrypting sensitive data is important as well, whether it's in transit or it's in data at rest, and when I mean data at rest, I mean, what's it doing when it's sitting on the server? Is it encrypted? Is it encrypted on the endpoint, like on the employee's computer? Is the computer, encrypted with BitLocker? This is kind of standard now. A lot of these security controls are standard, but still need to be switched on. So if you don't understand that you need to encrypt your data at rest, then it's just another vulnerability the attackers can take advantage of. And finally, I think conducting audits can help organizations understand their weaknesses and understand how to protect that sensitive information. Because auditors are usually well trained and well versed in effective strategies to protect that information that you may not even know about. So if you don't identify properly, use security audits to do the identification. And that can help you better prepare what to protect, and knowing what to protect as well is important. So audits really come in through pretty effectively because they help you identify these security holes.
Enjoying this episode of the Omega Podcast? We want to hear from you. Please share your thoughts or feedback in the comments. You can also visit Omega Consulting online for more resources, insights, and industry updates. Let's get back to the executive conversation.
No, that's fantastic. And I really appreciate you mentioning the zero trust approach, because I always am a proponent for assuming that there will be a breach. It's almost as if it's like this assumption of a breach mentality, right? How organizations should operate under the assumption that internal networks are already compromised instead of reacting to security incidents after they occur. As you mentioned, like zero trust enforces proactive measures such as segmentation, continuous monitoring, automated threat detection. I personally am a big proponent for it because this approach ensures that even if an attacker gains access, their ability to move laterally or escalate privileges is severely restricted by treating every request and interaction as potentially malicious. And I personally think it's just protecting your organization from, the impact of breaches, because you just don't know. Because I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know what the statistic is, but more often than not, the majority of these particular breaches are happening internally, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or if it's really that we're concerned about people outside, but I'm noticing that a lot of these threats are happening more internally by employees clicking on links to sites that they perhaps shouldn't be on, someone sending them a particular service, and then all of a sudden they click the link, and then now it's sharing their company information, and then they can use that person's passcodes and resources to then gain more internal access. I mean, the list can go on, but there's so much that we could think about, but I really appreciate how there's this ongoing collaboration between Black hackers and white hackers, and how that's contributing to improving overall cybersecurity for business. Can you sort of break down what's the main difference between a Black hacker and a white hacker, and how can organizations benefit from the skills of both?
Yes. So Black hackers exploit vulnerabilities for personal gain. whether it's financial or most of the time it is financial, while white hackers ethically identify and fix those vulnerabilities. So most of the time, white hat hackers are used to be black hat hackers and then legitimize themselves and work for organizations to help them audit their systems, right? So they have the skills to attack the systems. So in this case, they usually help organizations to audit them and find those vulnerabilities. And, by hiring these ethical hackers, they can uncover security gaps before malicious actors do. Because in cybersecurity, it's not if you'll face a threat, it's when you will face that threat. So it's important to be prepared at all times because, like you said, everyone's clicking on links, or if sometimes they're malicious. It can be hard to know when you're going to face that threat, but it's always good to be prepared. And white hat hackers are a really good tool for organizations and government and anyone who has a business that needs to check their security gaps.
Perfect. Thank you so much for elaborating, because many people hear that term and it can be misconstrued or convoluted, but I think breaking it down that way is so essential, because sometimes internally these resources and or organizations can actually hire these types of hackers to help identify the vulnerabilities of their organization and then go about the necessary steps to really reinforce that security, just to make sure that those vulnerabilities aren't there in the near future, especially as they build out. But as we think about protection, safeguarding, what are some practical steps individuals can take to protect themselves from becoming victims of cyber threats, including deepfakes? Because we mentioned prior about there being some sort of, malfunction with how we're viewing it. But, if you were already basically a victim of these cyber threats, what's next for you? Because now you've already been tricked, or in this sense, you've already been hacked. How do you proceed further? What I guess advice would you give someone like that that's already been like, hey, I've already been through this and, I really haven't learned my lesson, or I haven't done the necessary steps to reinforce it because of the initial costs, just hiring the right people, right, as being a hindrance, or just not having the infrastructure in place to combat ongoing threats?
Yes, that's a great question, because in cybersecurity, no target's too small, and hackers really attack big businesses or small businesses and individuals. And if you've already been tricked, then that hacker's probably going to return and trick you again. So the best way to really protect from that is understanding what tools are out there to play defense. And playing defense is pretty tough, but once you get your security awareness up and understand what these tools can do for you, that's going to help you tremendously, because multi-factor authentication, if you think about it, is the first step everyone should be taking to protect their accounts. And what multi-factor authentication is just another way to verify you besides your password and gain access to sensitive accounts. So MFA has been deployed in a lot of tools, a lot of things online. For example, your email accounts and different organizations, they usually have MFA as a capability to turn on. So first step is use MFA and understand what MFA does. It verifies you as a person, that you're confirming that login at that moment, and it's actually you by having something you have, something you know, and something you do. So verifying in another level can definitely help you protect you from, attackers attacking you again, and making sure you have the most updated tools like antivirus tools out there. VPNs, VPNs are virtual private networks, which means it encrypts your traffic no matter where you are if you turn it on. And it's important to have that. And personally, I like using Surfshark. I don't know if you've heard that company, but they do a really good job with their VPN, where they encrypt your data on transit when you turn it on, but they also have a platform that includes antivirus as well, and they protect your personal information. And understanding that these tools can do all this in one program is very useful. And I highly encourage people to understand what tools they are that can help you better protect yourself. And right now, there's ChatGPT and AI tools that can help you find the resources by simply asking it a question. So if you use ChatGPT and ask it, hey, I just fell victim to this type of cyber attack, how can I better protect myself in the future? ChatGPT does a great job in giving you resources on what tools are out there and the costs, and sometimes, and most of the time, some are free and open source. So while not getting too much into it, the practical steps of securing yourself is MFA, antivirus, and detection tools, and finding resources and studying up what could be good defense on certain attacks. And like you mentioned, Keenan, I want to dig in a little bit deeper about phishing, because that is the number one attack that is happening in this country, and it's phishing. And when I mean phishing, I don't literally mean fishing in the lake or trying to get a fish. I mean phishing is where you get sent an email that you weren't expecting most of the time, and sometimes it's urging you to do something right away, or it can try to persuade you to send money or do something out of the ordinary, and the link itself has malware if you click on it. So that attack is very hard to protect against, but it's not difficult if it's not impossible if you know what the red flags are. So understanding what phishing is and having a defense against that is definitely a good way to protect yourself from any attacks that are going to happen to you.
Perfect. I'm so glad you mentioned multi-factor authentication. I would even add two-factor authentication has been the norm, but something that's been in the up and coming, but already being utilized is biometrics, a fingerprint, your facial scan or facial recognition. That's also being utilized very much. As inconvenient as it can be sometimes, especially if you just want to access your email and you have to go through multiple prompts and verification and security codes. It's like, all I want to do is just answer an email and you have to go through all these prompts. It's time consuming, but I do believe in the end it is necessary, because if it's direct access and let's say you're a very high level decision maker, those vulnerabilities are there, and then you're basically throwing money out the window. But one thing I also talked about, and kind of in response to what you shared, is how organizations are developing their cybersecurity response plan and why it is essential for organizations to have one in place. What is your opinion of that, and what would be the most critical aspect of having one?
Great question. And to clarify, an incident response plan is definitely a big term that every organization should understand and should have in place, because incident response is referring to if you have an incident or cyber attack happen to your organization, that you have a proper strategy and protocol to respond to that incident. So I think the most important thing to have in an incident response plan is clear communication and designated actions and protocols in that plan. So with clear communication, knowing who needs to act, when, and how can save you precious time during an incident. Let's say your computer gets infected by ransomware and it's starting to spread through your organization. If you don't know that, you should probably take that endpoint offline, and that can help prevent a spread of ransomware, then you won't be prepared for that incident response plan unless you know that, right? So it's important to clearly communicate when an incident happens, because sometimes people don't even know what is considered an incident at the first place. So this is where security awareness comes in, and educating your employees, educating executives on what are incidents and what should be reported right away is very important in incident response plan. So making sure the people who can make a difference when an incident happens is important as well. So without a plan, organizations risk delayed responses, greater damage, legal liabilities, and reputational harm. So it's important to have a written formal plan and knowing who's the go-to person when certain things happen, right? So let's say there's a infection of my computer, then that means IT should be called. Or let's say the HVAC system was hacked and there's no more AC in the building. Well, there's a lot of people that need to be called, right? The IT, HR to notify employees that the HVAC isn't working, emergency services in case it gets too hot or too cold. Everyone has a role to play And it's just important to know what your role is when an incident happens.
Very well said. Are there any final remarks or thoughts that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Sure. I mean, in cybersecurity, I think complacency is the real threat. If we're not evolving and understanding our threats better, it leaves us vulnerable, and not understanding the cybersecurity world is very vulnerable for anyone, whether you're an organization or individual. Everything's running on computers nowadays, and it's important to know how to protect yourself because these technologies are advancing in rapid succession and rapid time that if you don't have the basics, then you're definitely going to either be left behind or taken advantage of. So cybersecurity is important to know that complacency is the real vulnerability.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Alfredo, for being on the Omega podcast.
Thank you, Keenan, for having me. This was an honor.